By the time the pot roast perfumed the house, the words that would bruise me were already on their way. Lemon polish lifted off the table I built years ago, the oak catching the last streaks of daylight like a held breath. I traced a knot with my thumb, remembering homework sprawling here, birthday candles, loose bike chains tightened while soup cooled. Outside, the first chill leaned against the windows. Inside, steam blurred their edges. I washed the garage's oil from my hands until the water ran clear, then traded the hum of a stubborn alternator for the clink of plates and soft music from the radio. Warmth gathered in the kitchen, the kind that makes you slow down without meaning to. On the sideboard sat a neat stack of programs for Saturday's Riverside Repair Shed dedication, the paper still smelling faintly of ink. My name, small on the back where sponsors live, looked almost shy. I slid the stack into the drawer with the napkin rings and shut it gently, as if closing a secret. Tonight was supposed to be about our daughter's engagement, not about me, not about mayors, plaques, or the quiet ledger of a life lived without fanfare. I checked the roast, laid out the good glasses, and set my father's old carving knife beside the board, its handle worn to my grip. The house felt ready, steady, proud. I didn't yet know how quickly a warm room can suddenly cool when achievement becomes a scorecard. The doorbell rang as the roast gave up its last cloud of steam, and for a second the house felt as it always had, warm, sturdy, forgiving. Our daughter floated in with her fiancé, trailed by his polished parents, all winter coats and perfume, cheeks bright from the cold. Compliments landed in thuds. Lovely home, such a sturdy table, what a charming neighborhood. I smiled, took jackets, and felt the rhythm of hosting settle into my hands. We sat, the knife slid through the roast, and the first stories circled, the proposal, the venue they liked, how fast the year would go. The fiancé's father asked about work, the kind of question simple or a test depending on how it's tilted. I said what I always say, I fix things mostly. Machines, fences, sometimes the wobbly parts of a day. It should have passed like a harmless cloud. Instead, our daughter laughed and said, "Dad's done nothing much, really, he just tinkers." She meant it as a joke to fit their world, and I watched it land like a pin on a balloon. My wife, trying to smooth, added, "He never cared for titles," and smiled to the guests as if made the air lighter. It didn't, it made the room tilt. At my own table in my own house, the fork in my hand felt heavy. Public show against private self. I could have corrected them. A dozen sentences tugged at my throat. Instead, I cut another slice past the carrots and let the scrape of forks cover the first seconds of hurt. The past does not need to be shouted to be true. When the conversation moved again, I set a kind of place card down. On Saturday, I said lightly, the Riverside Repair Shed is having its dedication. The mayor's saying a few words. You're all welcome to stop by if you like. The fiancé's mother brightened in the way people do when they hear the word mayor, her eyebrows lifting as if a door had opened onto a better room. "Oh, we'll try to stop by," she said, already picturing the handshake. Across the table, my daughter and my wife shared a small look, the kind that organizes a family's image without a word, gallery openings and posts versus sawdust and coffee in paper cups. I swallowed, not to hide but to keep the peace I value. The bruise would fade, the boundary would hold. I poured tea and talked about seating charts like that had been the only reason we gathered. But as the night softened around us, I could feel a thin edge slip under the door, promising there was more cutting to come before the morning arrived. By Saturday morning they had chosen the gallery, but the word mayor has a way of rearranging calendars. The shed smelled like fresh pine and coffee, sunshine laying strips of gold across workbenches, sawdust floating in the air like the softest snow. Kids dragged stools closer. A widowed neighbor waited with a broken latch in her hands, and the new lathe purred where my motorcycle used to live in my life. I was sweeping when my phone buzzed. "We might stop by," my wife wrote, "if it's not too crowded." A few minutes later, the fiancé's mother chimed in with a winking request for an introduction. I slid my phone into my pocket and kept sweeping. Let the day be about the work. Let the answers come from what could be touched and held. They arrived just before the speeches, coats neat, steps careful, eyes scanning past the flyers to the small cluster around the mayor. My daughter kissed my cheek, distracted but present, and my wife smoothed her scarf with hands that looked like apology practice but not yet spoken. I offered coffee, pointed out a bench the teens had sanded, and they nodded as if peeking into a neighbor's garden, pleasant but not their kind of view. The mayor cleared his throat and the room gathered itself. He talked about leaky faucets that no longer bled paychecks, about a high schooler who found steady hands where he thought he only had trouble, about a community choosing to hold itself together. Then he said there had been an anonymous founder, someone who had kept the lights on and the doors open when there were only ideas and a cold room. He pulled a string and a canvas drop cloth fell away from a bronze plaque. Riverside Repair Shed, it read, and underneath, founding coordinator, my name as plain as a handshake. A murmur rolled through the crowd, not loud, just warm. The mayor went on, he even sold a motorcycle to help us buy that lathe. And he pointed toward the corner where the machine gleamed softly like a promise kept. A young man I knew from too many tight-lipped afternoons stepped forward without prompting. He told the room the lathe kept him in school because he had something to be good at, because building a clean joint in ash felt better than breaking rules felt bad. He thanked me by looking me in the eye, and then he went back to his stool, which said everything. People clapped, not the wild kind, but the steady kind that feels like weather when it changes. I kept my hands at my sides. When the mayor motioned me forward, I said just enough, that tools in the right hands are kinder than lectures, that I'd learned patience from a table that took all winter to build, that the shed belonged to everyone in the room. The plaque did the heavy lifting. I let it. Beside me, my wife's fingers slipped around mine. She didn't squeeze hard, she didn't have to. My daughter's gaze had stopped roaming. It settled on the lathe, then traveled back to the plaque as if building a bridge between the two. "You sold the bike?" she asked in a voice meant only for me. I nodded. "So we could start," I said, no drama, just the hinge of it. The fiancé's parents were quiet, which is its own language. His mother recovered first, smiling and asking if I might introduce her to the mayor while it's natural. I did, but not before I showed them the photo board of repaired strollers and patched doors, faces that looked like my neighbors because they were. The mayor shook their hands, the room kept breathing, nothing was dramatized, and everything was clear. On the drive home, we'd talk about the aisle and a wobbling chair that wanted steady hands again. They came after all, drawn less by me than by the small knot of people around the mayor. The community center buzzed with sawdust and laughter, stroller wheels clicking over the concrete while work boots left dusty prints near the benches. Against that, their designer coats and careful smiles looked like glass set next to wood. I handed out paper cups of coffee and pointed to the table where teenagers were sanding a cedar plank, the air bright with pine and the radio low. My daughter kissed my cheek and scanned the room. My wife smoothed her scarf and kept her voice warm, but I could hear the thin worry underneath. The mayor stepped onto a crate, cleared his throat, and the noise drew itself into a circle. He spoke first about neighbors fixing neighbors, then about the nights when the shed's only heat came from our breath and a stubborn space heater. He thanked the donors listed in the programs and said there had been an anonymous founder who kept the rent paid and the doors open. When he pulled the cloth, the plaque caught the light. Riverside Repair Shed, founding coordinator, my name plain as a handshake. He nodded toward the corner where the lathe hummed. He said, because facts matter, that the seed money came from a motorcycle sold to buy that machine. A young man lifted a hand. He didn't say much, just that the lathe kept him in school because his hands stayed busy and his head grew quiet. He looked at me, said thank you, and sat down. The clapping was steady like a good rain. When the mayor waved me forward, I kept it short. I thanked the volunteers, the donors, the neighbors who brought pastries and patience. I said tools in the right hands make kinder days than speeches, and left it there. The respect didn't shout, it settled. My wife's fingers found mine, a small spool of warmth. My daughter's face softened. She seemed to see the room differently, the way a lens clicks into focus. The fiancé's parents went quiet, their networking done before it began. My daughter leaned close. "Did you really sell the bike for this?" she asked. I nodded. "So we could start." My wife whispered. I was wrong, not as a performance, but like a truth finally landing. I squeezed her hand, not to bind, just to say I heard. We stood in the hum of voices and the scent of wood and let the facts do the talking. On the way home, quieter conversations about respect were waiting. There would be time to mend what was frayed and to decide how we walk forward together with respect. Back home, the house held the warmth from the shed like a coat you don't take off. At the kitchen table, I said I'd walk her down the aisle if the invitation came with respect, not staging. Our daughter nodded, eyes wet, and asked if I'd teach her fiancé to fix the dining chair that wobbles when he leans. I fetched my father's toolbox from the hall, set it on the table, and felt the grain under my palm like a pulse returning. We tightened the joint together, slow turns, a lesson and a peace offering. My wife watched, then suggested we host a volunteer day at the shed, open to both families, no speeches, just work and pastries. I smiled, and we slid my father's tools back onto the shelf above the sideboard, not for storage, but for honor. One of the dedication programs went on the fridge with a magnet, a quiet truth anyone could see without me saying a word. If you like this story, please like and subscribe. Moral: the measure of a life isn't the titles people can point to, it's the people who can point to you. If you've lived a quiet story or learned to see worth beyond labels, share your experience.